Just unmute your microphone and ask away. I don't always see the chat icon, so we will get started then.
All right, thank you.
So today's contract training, we're going to be going through some of the additional addendum that you can attach to the offer to purchase, whether it is a residential offer to purchase or a condo offer to purchase. So specifically, we're going to be talking about Addendum R, Addendum S, and Addendum O. So I'm going to start off with just Addendum S, since this is the one that's most typically attached to offers. This is required if the property is built prior to 1978, which is stated right at the top here. So this is our lead-based paint disclosure. The lead-based paint disclosure will come from the seller, meaning the seller will sign on line 25, and most listing agents will attach a copy of Addendum S with the seller's signature to MLS. So when your buyer is writing an offer on a property where this is required, you just have to download it off of MLS, similar to what you would do with the real estate condition report, and then have your buyer sign, which we'll go through in just a minute. So Addendum S is simply a disclosure about lead-based paint, that the property was built in a time where lead paint was used. It goes through some of the risks associated with lead paint, more related to children and developmental risks if they end up ingesting any lead paint. So the seller is simply making a disclosure up at the top here that says, seller hereby represents the seller has no knowledge of any lead-based paint or any lead-based paint hazards present in or on the property except blank. And then here's where they would explain any information known to the seller. I will say more often than not, I actually don't think I've ever seen anything additional disclosed here from a seller. Typically they're putting in NA, that they're not aware of any, anything special. And then they would go ahead and sign on line 25. The rest of the form really just goes through, again, some additional disclosures. I just want to point out line 33, which states the seller shall provide the buyer with an EPA approved lead hazard information pamphlet. This typically does not come from the seller. I'm going to back out here. However, as if you're a buyer's agent, you do have a duty to provide this to your buyer. So this lead paint pamphlet is automatically dropped into your template in zip form if you create a transaction using the global residential offer listing template, or I'm sorry, offer packet template. So you can see here, this is the lead-based paint pamphlet. That essentially is more of a lengthy disclosure that buyers should be receiving if they write an offer on a property that's built prior to 1978. So definitely be sure that you share this with your buyers. It could also be something that you put into your buyer consultation packet, that you're giving it to them right away. A lot of houses in southeastern Wisconsin were built prior to 1978, so it's pretty likely that buyers will be writing on homes that need to be have this disclosure. The second page, again, more disclosures. I have never gone through this line by line with any buyers, but as with any form, it can't hurt you to kind of read through this just to have a general understanding of some of these disclosures. Again, the biggest thing is giving the buyer that pamphlet, because this disclosure does state that the buyer is in receipt of that. Page 3 does require your signature as a buyer's agent and as a listing agent. So again, typically this is going to be in MLS, where you'll have the seller signing page 1 and the listing agent signing on line 119, and then the buyer's agent would sign on 121. So this acknowledgement is that all agents in this transaction, subject to federal LBP law, hereby acknowledge that 1, seller was informed of his or her obligations under the federal lead-based paint law, and 2, they are aware of their duty to ensure compliance with the requirements of the lead-based paint law. So again, biggest thing is just, if you're a buyer's agent, share that pamphlet with your buyers. The last part of this addendum is the buyer does have the opportunity to do a lead-based paint inspection. So that's what this lines 123 to 148 is in reference to. So if no box is checked, the buyer is deemed to have elected a 10-day contingency to do lead-based paint inspection. I am not aware of any buyer who has ever done a lead-based paint test, but they do have the opportunity to do so. So if you have a buyer that is insistent on having a lead-based paint inspection contingency, they would check this box, or again, if you leave it all the boxes blank, then that contingency is all automatically deemed a part of the offer, where they would have the opportunity to do that testing or to do that inspection. Again, I've not ever come across a buyer who has opted to do this. I think it's, it's safe to assume if the house was built prior to 1978 that there is lead paint in the house, maybe under multiple layers of paint, but I don't know, Steph, have you heard of any buyers that have ever?
It's never once happened that I've seen.
Yeah. I mean, if you do have a buyer that is insistent, let me know. I mean, from what I understand, it's a very expensive test from what I have heard. I honestly am not entirely sure what the process is to test for lead-based paint, but it is an option for buyers. So more often than not, I would say most 100% of the time, you're gonna, as a buyer's agent, check box 148, which states that the buyer waives the opportunity for a lead-based paint inspection or assessment. And again, the way I kind of explain it to a buyer is, if this house was built before 1978, they would not be signing this if it wasn't built before 1978. And if it was, pretty safe to assume there's lead-based paint. It's typically going to be painted over multiple times, or as long as the paint isn't peeling or cracking, there's not a huge risk. But again, biggest thing with Addendum S is sharing that pamphlet with the buyers, and ensuring they're understanding what that pamphlet is covering, and then you signing as the buyer's agent, and then the buyer's signing as well on the bottom. But again, line 148 is typically what's going to be checked. As a listing agent, you want to be sure that at least that 148 is checked, because again, if not, you're opening up your sellers to potentially having the buyers have the opportunity to do a lead-based paint test. So this is just a common thing that sometimes need to be countered in an offer if a buyer's agent forgets to check box 148. Any questions on Addendum S? All right. We'll move into Addendum R next. So Addendum R is the rental addendum. This is typically attached to offers in the event that there are current leases in place that extend beyond closing. So that the buyer is going to be assuming those tenants. I always encourage agents to use Addendum R, even though there is a provision, or a very small provision, in the offer to purchase that acknowledges leased property. This goes into much greater detail, and we'll go through some of some additional requests that the buyer can make. So I think attaching Addendum R to properties where there are current tenants that leases are going to extend beyond closing, just attach Addendum R, even if you don't use all the provisions. So you date the offer to purchase, acknowledge who the buyer is, the property address. Here's where we acknowledge what personal property is included. So the following appliances and equipment included in the sale are now and will be at closing in good working order. You state the number of each category of item included in sale and attach detail schedule if necessary. So let's say, for example, your buyer is purchasing a duplex. So there's 2 units in the duplex. So maybe there's 2 refrigerators, 2 stoves, 2 garbage disposal. Maybe there's 1 lawnmower that's staying with the unit, etc. So you're going to go through, and it's kind of a repeat of the inclusions in the offer to purchase. It does indicate that the total value of these items is blank. And it says this amount shall be excluded from the real estate purchase price on the Wisconsin real estate transfer return. Title to these items shall be transferred at closing by bill of sale. I typically never see a dollar amount here. Typically these items are just included as part of the purchase price, similar to what we would see in the offer to purchase when you're listing those inclusions. I have not ever seen issues with lenders. You know, sometimes when we do list inclusions, once we kind of get into, like, maybe if you're listing lawnmowers, snow blowers, things like that, they might say those need to be removed. Typically, they don't like to see things like that, but refrigerators, stoves, garbage disposal, furnaces, lenders typically don't have issues with those being included in the purchase price. So you don't always have to indicate a value for these inclusions here. And I would say it's pretty rare to see a value here. Again, if there is no value, the assumption is that all of these are included in the purchase price. The rent schedule is really important to include. So let's say you've got 2 units, you list the unit numbers, acknowledging the lease expiration date and the tenancy type. So is it month to month? Is it a 12 or a 1-year lease? What is the rent amount? What's the security deposit? Are there any delinquent rents, any penalties levied? I would say I typically don't see anything filled in here, unless of course it's applicable, but this information, of course, you would need to get from the seller or the listing agent. So even on the flip side, as a listing agent, if you're listing a house that is a rental, this protects both sides. So having this information ready, and you as a buyer's agent can call the listing agent ahead of time before writing the offer to get this information. Or you can, if you can't get it before you're writing the offer, submitting the offer, you can put a provision in the offer to purchase that states, you know, seller is to complete lines 13, 14 of Addendum R, or whatever information is missing, no later than, and putting in a date that the seller needs to get this information to you. But ideally, you'll have this information prior to submitting the offer. Then it goes on to address the leases. So it states complete copies of all current leases and rental applications for tenants are either attached to this offer or shall be furnished to buyer within blank days of acceptance. So you're going to strike one of those. If buyer does not receive these documents by the applicable deadline or disapproves of the same, buyer may deliver written notice of no receipt or disapproval to seller within blank days of acceptance, and this offer shall be null and void. So it gives your buyer time to review all of those current leases, rental applications, etc. Indemnification. At closing, seller shall assign all right, title, and interest in the leases to the buyer, and the buyer shall assume all duties, liabilities, and obligations thereunder as landlord. Buyer shall indemnify and hold seller harmless from any claim or loss first arising from events occurring after closing. A note about rent. All rent for the month of closing shall be prorated through the day prior to closing. Seller may collect any delinquent rent which was due before closing for seller's account. So these are, I mean, as we read through these, I mean, you'll see why this addendum is so helpful to attach versus just using that leased provision in the offer to purchase. It addresses security deposits. The seller shall transfer the full amount of all security deposits to buyer at closing without offset unless the parties otherwise agree in writing. Always, always need to be sure you're reviewing the closing statement when you're on the selling and buy side, especially if there is leases extending beyond closing. You want to be sure that those security deposits, all those prorations, are on the closing statement. Seller may pursue any claims that seller may have against tenants directly against the tenants. Any interest on security deposits required by local ordinance shall be prorated and credited to buyer at closing. Tenant records. Seller shall give buyer a copy of all tenant records at closing, including any check-in reports, payment records, correspondence notices, etc. Buyer or seller shall give all tenants written notice within 10 days of closing, advising them of the sale and all new contact information for rent payment, maintenance, legal process, and correspondence. So I would say, you know, this provision here, one is a listing agent. If your seller doesn't have check-in reports or payment records, things like that, make sure that's communicated to the buyer ahead of time, and you probably will want to strike this or counter the offer to strike some of this information if the seller doesn't have it. As far as giving the tenants written notice, you know, I would leave it up to your buyer. You know, it might be a nice opportunity for your buyer to begin that contact with their tenants. If the notice comes from them that, hey, tenant, I'm your new landlord. And obviously you'll be able to get their contact information from the seller. Change in status. The seller shall give buyer prompt written notice of any tenancy termination, unit abandonment, material breach of lease terms, or rent delinquency continuing for more than blank days occurring after the date of this offer. Unless otherwise agreed by the parties in writing, seller shall give delinquent tenants appropriate notices of default, evict tenants who fail to timely cure their defaults, sue evicted tenants for delinquent rents and damages in excess of security deposits, repair damaged units, and re-rent vacant units. So, you know, buyer would need to determine a number of days here. This is one that I do see left blank more often than, you know, any of the others. Again, if it's like a duplex, maybe they're not really that concerned if, you know, one of the tenants terminates their lease agreement because they're not worried about finding another tenant, whatever the case may be. But it is an option to include in the offer.
Yeah. What do you think, Kimmy? What do you think would be a reasonable amount of days? Like
so
5, 7. I mean,
for a tenant who's delinquent in rent for more than, I don't know, 5 days is probably too short.
yeah.
I mean, I'd say 30 days is probably, maybe that would be like a month behind on their rent.
Right.
And again, this is occurring after the date of this offer. So assuming that, you know, from the date of the offer to closing is probably not going to be much more than 30 days. Maybe 15 is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. No, just. I think 2 weeks is probably reasonable for that.
2 weeks. You're probably 14
Yeah.
days.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, eviction. So it states after closing, seller or buyer shall complete any eviction action begun before closing at that party's cost. Seller shall have buyer substituted as plaintiff in any pending eviction action at seller's cost if buyer must complete the action. If seller gave tenants notice prior to closing to vacate the premises and the tenants have failed to timely comply with the notice, seller or buyer shall take all steps necessary to remove the tenants, including the filing of an eviction action at that party's cost. So typically I see either this not addressed or that it falls to the seller to complete any eviction action begun before closing at that party's cost. The only thing with that, I mean, if the seller obviously isn't the owner of the property anymore, are they going to really be motivated to continue with the eviction process? I don't know. So the buyer might want to take over that responsibility. With COVID, there was a period of time where landlords couldn't start an eviction process, but that is over. So unless the property is considered a covered property under the CARES Act, landlords can start evictions now. I would say if you have if you have a seller who's starting an eviction, or things are still very fluid right now is I guess what I'm trying to say. So come to me or staff with any questions about, if your sellers aren't sure, can they evict or, but as of the last, 2 months, they weren't able to start any evictions. But it's nice that this addendum addresses it if need be. This part is, line 45 to 48 is nice for those buyers who wish to occupy the property. So maybe it's a duplex and maybe both units are currently being leased. But maybe the buyers want to occupy one of the properties. You can check line 45, which states the seller shall give all notices necessary to terminate the tenancy of the tenants in unit blank, so that these units will be vacant either at closing or on a certain date. The only thing the buyer just has to be aware of is the seller still has to comply with landlord-tenant laws, which there's a minimum. They have to give at least, I think it's 28 days notice for month to month. And I'm honestly not entirely sure what the rules state with regards to like if the tenant has a year-long lease and the landlord is terminating the lease agreement early. I'm not even sure if that's allowed. So if you are in the situation and you need the answer, just let me know and I will certainly find the answer for you. But it is nice that this is an option to include in the offer. And then the last piece is new vacancies. If blank or more units which were occupied on the date of this offer are vacant on the day before closing, buyer shall have the option to give seller written notice and this offer shall become null and void. So, theoretically a buyer could say if one or more unit which were occupied on the day of this offer are vacant on the day before closing, the buyer can essentially terminate the offer. This isn't a provision I typically see, but again, it's there if the buyer would like it to be. Any other questions on Addendum R?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
In the leases section, for line 21 and line 22, what are the typical number of days you see there?
Good question. That would be like a shorter period of time. So I would typically see like 3 days, 5 days. It shouldn't take a seller long to compile. I mean, hopefully they have all that information ready. Okay. And again, on the flip side, if you're the listing agent, letting your seller know, hey, this is information that the new owner is going to need. So yeah, I would say probably no more than 7 days.
Okay.
3 to 7 days is typical. Good question. And then the second piece, if buyer does not receive these documents by the applicable deadline or disapproves, buyer may deliver written notice to seller within blank days of acceptance, and this offer shall be null and void. So, if this is 7 days that the seller has to provide the documents to the buyer, maybe it's 10 days that the buyer then has to review and then make a decision. So maybe they've got like a 3-day window if the seller really takes all 7 days to get those documents over. So definitely want this to be longer than this deadline. Great question. Any others? Okay, moving on to Addendum O. So Addendum O is an occupancy agreement. The occupancy agreement, I see them executed sometimes right initially, you know, right from the get-go when they're writing the offer. Other times, I would say more often than not, you see it executed after an offer is already accepted. You know, maybe it just as you're negotiating the closing date more, and maybe it's typically when the seller needs a few more additional days in the property after closing. This is when it's typically used. So again, you're acknowledging that the offer to purchase date, the buyer's name, property address. Then it states that this agreement relates to the following premises: the property, which is the property on line 3. Or you could put in a additional premise. Maybe there's a separate, I don't really know, honestly know what you would put here, what would be another option, but because again, this is typically related to the home, right? So occupancy period. So what type of occupancy agreement is this? Is this the buyer giving the seller post-closing occupancy, which again, this is the most common type of occupancy agreement. Typically when a seller, maybe they're buying another home and they just want a few extra, like 3 days so that they can close on this home and then use those funds to buy their next home. But they don't have to move out then the same day, which can be really stressful to buyers, or excuse me, to sellers. So this is post-closing occupancy. Sellers remain as occupants in the property after closing. So you would put an end date. So maybe if the closing is June 30th, but sellers have said, you know what, we would like occupancy until July 3rd. And then you can put a time here. If you don't put a time, then it's, you know, 11:59 p.m. But I would put a time so it's clear. Okay, end of business day on July 3rd. Because nobody's going to be moving out of the house, you know, at 3 a.m., hopefully. The other type of occupancy is the pre-closing occupancy, so that the buyer gets occupancy prior to closing. So it's saying that the seller grants to the buyer pre-closing occupancy of the premises beginning on, so if closing is June 30th, maybe they're going to give buyers occupancy on June 26th at 10 a.m. And ending at closing. So pre-closing occupancy, not recommended. I have heard horror stories about pre-closing occupancy. Worst thing that can happen is buyer gets, let's say closing is June 30th, seller gives buyer pre-closing occupancy, buyers move in 4 days before closing. They're there through the weekend, they're, you know, noticing things about the house, they're maybe falling out of love with the house, and because they can really see the house and they're living in it, and then they just decide, you know what, we're not going to go to closing. We don't want to buy this house anymore. So that has happened a number of times. And if that does happen, attorneys need to get involved, and it's not a great situation for anybody. So that's why I discourage pre-closing occupancy. It certainly is possible, again, if all parties understand what, you know, the risks, but it's still an option for everybody. Again, post-closing occupancy is most common. It's just typically giving those sellers an extra couple of days to get the property cleaned up and moved out before the buyers get to move in. I've also seen post-closing occupancy for like for a whole month. I mean, you could have it be as long as they need it, but, or I should say as long as they agree upon, but typically with the occupancy agreement, you know, I wouldn't use an occupancy agreement for more than 30 days, because then you're kind of getting into a situation where the homeowner, the new buyer, is essentially like a landlord, which they might want to execute more of like a lease agreement if it's going to be for more than 30 days. So the next piece of this is the occupancy charge. There typically is an occupancy charge. The occupant shall prepay a certain amount per day or partial day of occupancy, which shall be held by blank. So in the most common situation where the seller is has post-closing occupancy, the dollar amount is typically calculated using the buyer's like their financing terms. So if they know that they're based on their down payment and their interest rate, their monthly payment of principal and interest is going to be $1,000. Let's prorate that then. If we're going to be here for 3 days, what is my daily essentially mortgage, and then multiplying that by 3 days. So that's typically how you calculate the occupancy charge. You could just throw out, buyer could just say, hey, or seller could just say, hey, I'll pay you $3,000, you know, or $300. It could just be a flat dollar amount. It doesn't have to be based on the buyer's mortgage. Whatever the seller and buyer agree upon. And then held by, so it could be held by, I would say typically this is taken, it's on the closing statement. Payment is due at the beginning of the occupancy period. Any unearned portion of the occupancy charge is or is not refundable based upon actual occupancy. So I would say typically for as far as who holds the occupancy charge, the home or the seller could hold it, or the buyer could hold it, whoever is, you know, receiving the payment. We as a firm can hold it as well. So if parties would prefer that, we could hold the payment until the occupancy period is over. I would say typically it's held by the parties. So, you know, buyer brings a check to closing for this amount, and just gives it to the seller if they're doing pre-closing, or vice versa if it's post-closing. Does that make sense? I feel like that was a long-winded way of saying what I just said. All right, security deposit. This I don't always see. Sometimes people just kind of leave this part blank. I would say I typically see this blank if it's a very short occupancy period, especially if it's a post-closing. So if seller's just staying there for an additional 3 days, buyers don't really seem to worry about having a security deposit. In the event they do choose to, you know, if buyers are giving sellers post-closing occupancy and they say, we want a $1,000 security deposit, again, it can be held by the buyer, who would be the new homeowner, or it could be held by Keller Williams. Payment is due at the beginning of the occupancy period. In a pre-closing occupancy, the entire amount of the security deposit shall be refunded to the buyer upon the closing of this offer. So that would be, I would assume, on the closing statement where you would see that refund. In all other cases, the security deposit shall be refunded at the end of the occupancy period, except that the owner may withhold for occupant damage, waste, or neglect, not including normal wear and tear. So it's just like a typical security deposit that you would see with a rental. I think that the tricky part is, you know, how does a homeowner determine damage, waste, neglect, etc.? which I think is why some people just kind of leave it off. They just don't want to, I don't know. I just don't see this very often, but legal counsel should be consulted should a dispute arise regarding the parties' legal rights, or if they're disagreeing over whether they should be able to hold some of the security deposit after the occupancy period ended. And then keep in mind too, anything that happens, like if this is a post-closing occupancy, agents, you know, our duties are finished at closing. So if anything happens after closing with regards to an occupancy agreement, the parties would need to be deferred to an attorney. So that's just something to keep in mind. Utilities. So the occupant shall have all utilities services rendered in the occupant's name and shall pay all bills for utility services during the occupancy period as they become due. To the extent that this cannot or is not done, utilities shall be prorated based upon the occupancy date. So again, in a post-closing situation where a seller is occupying the property after closing, just keeping in mind with utilities, you know, notifying cable, gas, electric, things like that, not to shut it off until the occupancy period ends, versus typically you would stop those payments on the closing date. Maintenance. The occupant will be responsible for all routine repairs and normal maintenance of the premises and personal property included in the offer during the occupancy period. Occupant shall maintain the premises, including any heating, sewer, plumbing, and electrical systems, any built-in appliances and equipment, the exterior and grounds, and included personal property in reasonable repair and normal working order during the occupancy period. Major repairs and major maintenance items costing more than blank shall be the responsibility of owner. So I would say like 20, well, I've seen like anywhere between 1,000 and 2,500. I actually have a personal, so when I sold my last home, this dollar amount, I think it was about $1,000. So we had about 4 days of post-closing occupancy. And so during that post-closing occupancy period, we technically were not the owners anymore. We were the occupants. And something happened with our stove that we had to get repaired. And it only cost like $200. So that was our responsibility. So we paid for that repair. We got the stove in working order again. If it cost more than $1,000, let's say the whole stove broke and we needed to buy a new stove, we would have had to go to our buyer, technically the new homeowner, and it would have been their responsibility. So that's kind of a narrative of how that plays out. Keys. So during the occupancy period, the occupant shall have how many keys and the owner shall have how many keys. So occupant shall have 1, 2 keys. Owner shall have 1 or 2 keys. That's typically what I see. Owner shall be admitted to the premise at reasonable times upon blank hours advance notice. I would say 24 hours is typical here. Advance notice for the following purposes: inspecting the property and whatever else. Again, with a short post-closing occupancy, there's typically not a need for the owner. You know, maybe they're getting carpeting installed, so they know that they're going to need to come in and get measurements or something. But property taxes. So real estate taxes for the premises shall be prorated through the day, either prior to closing or through the occupancy date. I would say typically occupancy date is struck. That's typically what I see, so that it reads the taxes are still prorated through the day prior to closing. It says, note, if tax prorations are to be as of the occupancy date, The closing prorations provisions in this offer are hereby amended to provide that net general real estate taxes shall accrue to seller and be prorated at closing through the occupancy date. So it's just a matter of really more on the buyer. How long, I think too, it depends on how long that occupancy period is. Or I should say more so if it's a pre-closing occupancy. You know, if it's a pre-closing occupancy, if I'm the seller, I'd probably want the taxes prorated through the day prior to closing. Typically, it's not a huge, again, these occupancy periods are so short that it typically doesn't make much of a difference, but.
Kimmy, if it is like, let's say a month, somebody staying there, would they then add on a prorated amount in addition to the payment that they would be paying based on their lease agreement or their lender agreement or financing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say, yeah, if you have a longer occupancy period, so let's say this is a post-closing occupancy and they're going to be there close to 30 days after closing, maybe that tax proration could be kind of built into that occupancy charge so that the taxes are still only prorated through closing, but that, you know, seller is still paying for their portion of that months of taxes. So yeah, definitely something to take into consideration if that occupancy charge does not include taxes, then you'd probably want the taxes prorated through the occupancy date so that the seller is paying that month of taxes. Great question. And then the last piece of this is termination. So in a post-closing occupancy, if the seller fails to give possession of the premises to the buyer on the occupancy date, the buyer may initiate legal action to recover possession of the premises. All charges imposed in this addendum for the loss of use of the premises in the amount of blank per day, any other damages, and all reasonable costs and reasonable attorney's fees. This dollar amount, again, I think it depends on the price of the home. I mean, I've seen anywhere from $500 to $1,500. Fortunately, I've never seen this come into play, but it is obviously certainly possible. Yeah, and then it goes on to say that if the buyer is occupying the premises pre-closing, and then the transaction does not close by the date set in the offer, the buyer will surrender possession of the premises to the seller within blank days of the scheduled closing date, unless otherwise agreed in writing. So if I'm a seller, you know, I'd want this to be short, maybe like 3 days, 2 days. I wouldn't want them staying in the property any longer than they need to if this transaction isn't going to close. And then there's a spot to add any additional provisions as needed. The second page of this does include hold harmless. The occupant will hold owner harmless for all liabilities, claims, or expenses resulting from occupant's use, possession, and occupancy of the premises. It explains the use of premises. The occupant shall be entitled to peacefully and quietly have, hold, and enjoy the premises during the occupancy period. Occupant will make no changes, alterations, or improvements to the premises without the prior written consent of the owner. There shall be no assignment, or subleasing of these occupancy rights. And then just acknowledging that this is not a landlord-tenant agreement. So, any other questions on Addendum O?
I have another question. It's not covered here, but I'm wondering, have you ever come across a situation where the home that the seller has listed is vacant, they've already moved out, and the buyer wants to know if they could move in, I don't know, a couple couches and things before closing? And the seller says, fine, but do you need any kind of paperwork for that, or? Or is it just
That's a
a good
great
faith?
question. I've seen sellers allow this, and I've seen it to like varying degrees where some sellers will say, yes, you can move items in, but you can only move them into the garage or into the basement or something. And then I've seen other situations where, you know, buyers are fully moving their furniture in, but they're not actually living there. I do think attaching an addendum O, even if they're not going to be living there, I think it's nice to do because of the hold harmless that's in here. So if, you know, there's damage, if the buyer's movers damage any of the property or something, and it may not even need to be, you know, obviously you can attach addendum O and you don't have to acknowledge, like, maybe it's a very small occupancy charge, and then in the other provisions, you make an acknowledgement that this occupancy agreement is only for allowing buyer to move furniture in. Buyer will not be occupying the property, just basically stating what the agreement is. But maybe you're not completing a lot of this information. I do think it's still nice to have attached. So again, the idea is just having the agreement in writing, whether it's an extensive agreement or a very short agreement, that at least you have it in writing, and this kind of serves as a nice template, if you will. So. All right, any other questions?
I have a question, Kimmy.
Yeah.
So as far as, okay, this is on zip form, right? So are zip form and like DocuSign, are they all connected?
Yes, they are. So I can take you through a quick little tutorial on this. Next Monday is compliance and command training, where actually Steph is going to be leading it, and she'll be going through this start to finish. So definitely tune in next week as well. So let me just open up DocuSign here. I'm going to start through here. So when you're initially setting up an opportunity, I'm going to go into my opportunities here. Let me do this. So I always recommend you create the transaction in zip form first. Creating the transaction in zip form, so going to zipformplus.com, creating the transaction here will allow you to create a transaction using one of the templates, and applying the templates to the transaction. I'm frozen here. Will pull in the most applicable forms, so you don't have to spend time searching for all the different forms that you're going to need. Hang on here. And then essentially what you're going to be doing is linking this zip form transaction into DocuSign. So if this, let's say, is my opportunity to create the DocuSign room in your opportunity, the first time you open your opportunity, this is going to say start a transaction. I've already created the transaction in DocuSign, so now it says go to transaction. So this is opening a DocuSign room. And now, so I've got my DocuSign room, and then I also have my, just going to use this transaction here, the strike through test. I have this transaction created in zip form. And I created this transaction using our templates. Do you want me to go through that too? Okay, let me back up here. So I'll kind of start from the beginning here. So to create a transaction in zip form, I'm going to select the transaction type, give it a name, select the category, and then down here you select the template. They'll all start with the word global. And then you can see you've got different condo options and different residential and vacant land. So I'm going to say this is a residential offer packet. Click Save. Now, if I look under Documents, so you'll see these documents automatically dropped in, which again is the reason behind creating a transaction in zip form and applying the template. Otherwise, you'd have to go into all forms and you'd have to manually pull in each form that you need. And then the other nice thing too is all of our forms in the template, where applicable, we have some language like crash printed into the forms. So like our firm name is where it needs to be in some places. There's just some default language that's nice in the offer to purchase, for example. In the residential offer to purchase, the closing date provision is edited already to say that the transaction's to be closed at the place selected by the buyer, things like that. So a lot of perks to pulling the forms from our templates. So now that I have this transaction created in zip form, you can always just work directly out of zip form. There are plenty of agents that like zip form. They don't even go into DocuSign room. You can do e-sign directly in zip form. You can execute everything right in here. The perk of creating this DocuSign room and linking it to then zip form. So let me pause here and I'll show you how that works. So this is my DocuSign room. So now when I want to add forms here, I can add from zip form. I think I'm going to have to unlink a room here. Hang on. Yeah. Ignore what I'm doing right now. Hopefully you won't have to do that. All right. So if I'm adding to zip form, adding from zip form, I should say. Basically what I'm doing right now is I'm linking that zip form transaction that I just created into my DocuSign room. So it's asking me to link the room. And did I do 123 East Main Street or just 123 Main Street? Gotta see which one it is. Here it is. Click link. And once they're linked, theoretically, you never need to go back into your zip form window because all of your forms will be right in here in your DocuSign room. So I'm going to add forms from my linked transaction. It's extra slow right now, of course. And it's going to pull the list of all of these forms that I added from the templates. Come on, there we go. So these are all the forms in this list here is everything you're seeing in this window. So I can either add them all or I can just add a select few that I want. And then click add. So again, once I link the transaction, I really don't ever need to go back into zip form because I can just add forms directly from the zip form library. Now again, the perk of going into and creating this DocuSign room is to then, final step is getting your forms uploaded for compliance review, which all happens through a command into your opportunity. When you add a file, you can browse from your desktop. So if you're executing everything in zip form, you get an offer to purchase signed, or a buyer agency agreement signed, let's say. You download it to your desktop, then you go over to command, and then you upload from your browser. Whereas if you have it all in DocuSign, you can select, okay, I'm going to upload from DocuSign, and all your forms are right here. So it just kind of saves you the step of downloading it to your desktop and pulling it right from DocuSign. The other nice thing is, and Command has continuously gotten better and better at this over the last couple months, but because the intent behind DocuSign Rooms and Command is the least amount of double data entry that you have to do. So you've already created that contact in Command, you've created the opportunity. So now if you're opening up, or for example, you're sending documents off to be signed, and you go to envelopes and you're creating the envelope, it is acknowledging your recipient's email address. I've skipped a bunch of steps, so it's not going to pull it. But whereas if you're executing everything in zip form, you're going to have to manually add their name and email address. And again, that's getting better and better. It's not perfect right now, but the eliminating the double data entry is, of course, a big time saver. So there's some perks to getting everything in DocuSign Rooms. Does that help answer question?
Yeah, it does help. So you prefer everything in the DocuSign room, and then it connects to Command, and then how do we, because you need to review it first, right? So I don't know.
So compliance review happens after everything is executed. So after you have an accepted offer, let's say, you would upload all of your offer paperwork into the placeholders.
Got it. That's after everything. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And there is also, I have a compliance and command, like Google Drive folder. Tracy, do you have access to that? Not sure.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
So what was that again?
It's a Google Drive where I've like compiled just different training guides.
Oh,
so
yeah, I have that.
Okay, perfect. There's a whole,
Okay.
The first training I ever did it's recorded. I have that in there. You can rewatch that, and there's just some other additional like tutorials on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Anybody else have anything that we want me to go over? I will say the one thing, just to kind of wrap up addendum and addendas and things like that. Always need to remember, anytime you're attaching addendums to the offer to purchase, whether it's addendum R, O, S, or even GMAR addendum A, which again is the most commonly attached addendum, is you have to actually formally attach it to the offer to purchase. So here we go. So last page of the offer acknowledges the addenda and what is attached. So you can list them all here. There's also a place on GMAR addendum A on the last page that acknowledges some if additional addenda are attached. If you are attaching an addendum after acceptance, you need to do an amendment to the offer to purchase and acknowledge that that addendum is attached. So minor paperwork kind of formality, but important nonetheless. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining today. And like I said, next week at this time, we'll be going through compliance in command. And that's it for today.
Great. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see you at the next one, Tracy.
Yes. I'll see you then.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.